The ideas and information explored in this webinar are featured in Carrie Lockhart's new book, What to Expect When You're Expected to Teach Gifted Students, available from proofrock.com, Amazon, Barnes& Noble, or your favorite local bookseller.
Now, without further ado, let me introduce our author today, Carrie Lockhart. I just love that Carrie comes to us as a consummate practitioner. She's been in the classroom for over 10 years. She was a former classroom English teacher. She was a former gifted and talented teacher. She has been a campus administrator. She is currently a district level advanced academics coordinator, and she's working in the doctoral program at UNT, working on her doctorate in ed psych with a specialization in gifted education. So let me welcome Carrie Lockhart. Carrie.
Hi, Joel. Thank you guys so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here today. I'm seeing the participant numbers click up, and I think this is the largest groups of folks I've ever spoken to, so I'm really excited to be with you.
Yeah. You know, we started these webinars, probably a year ago, and I had to, I think we had our webinar, we had our attendee maximum was about 100, I think, and we didn't cross that until all of a sudden this terrible virus struck, and I was a little bit bored and didn't know what to do with myself, and I thought these webinars would be great. Well, it was just like it struck a chord, and we've had hundreds of folks signing up for these things, and I'm really excited about that. Carrie, tell me a little bit, how did you come to gifted education? How did you get into it?
Well, I sort of backed into education in a very roundabout way. I graduated as an undergraduate with a psych and English double major. And, as many folks out there know, without a master's degree in either one of those, you don't have super high level opportunities. So I pursued alternative certification. I thought, gosh, I really like English. I love being in the English classroom. Maybe I'd like to teach it. And I did. Um, and as I worked with a variety of different student populations. All of my teaching experience was in Title I schools. And so for those folks who are out of the country, those schools serve primarily lower income of students. So, I mean, I've taught really a variety of kiddos, and I noticed, man, we have a lot of provisions for a lot of students with a lot of needs, and that's wonderful. But gosh, some of our bright kids really slip through the cracks. And so in noticing that, and in having just various opportunities to pursue gifted, I've worked in a school system and opened a campus, and so I had the ability to say, yeah, I'd like to teach gifted, as we're getting that program off the ground. So just a combination of opportunity, and just really recognizing that we have a group of kids that need something different and something more.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Let me while we're thinking about the intro to you and your book, let me show folks the your book. This is this is a hard book to write, I would imagine. And as I looked at the manuscript when it came in, I thought, you really did have a challenge, because we we define gifted child in different ways, and we have different models for how we serve gifted kids, and we have different programming philosophies. And suddenly you're tasked with the job of, say, well, how would you write an introduction for a teacher who's just coming into one of these many programs? And so you've had to cover a lot of bases in a short book. It's really supposed to be a sort of a, here, hand this to a teacher, and this is the sort of introduction to gifted education for a practitioner that gives you a sort of a broader sense of what gifted ed is. So I'm showing that up there for the folks that, you can purchase this book at proofrock.com, but it is certainly also available on Amazon.com, Barnes& Noble, or your favorite local bookseller. I would encourage you to get a copy of this. It's a wonderful book, but I think one of the things that's really valuable about this book is it's not just good for teachers who are, the first year teacher. This is a book, I suspect, after looking at the manuscript, every teacher of the gifted could. This is a good primer. It's a good refresher, and it's also good for coordinators too, because you really talk about building a program based on a philosophy that you've outlined earlier in the book. So I think you did a nice job of tackling a pretty large topic. How did you go about doing that? Like how there gifted programs are as diverse as gifted kids. How did you try to encapsulate all that into just an intro text?
Well, I will give the program at UNT a plug. We spend all of our time in the classroom talking about which definition of gifted, do you think is the most reasonable, what's the most, and so we spend a ton of time looking at those theories. So certainly having the background of understanding where different paradigms and where different schools of thought come from, it's all very interesting, but part of my work experience has been as an instructional coach for English language arts, and then working to coordinate different types of gifted and talented programs. So you can have theory all day long, but when the rubber meets the road, you really have to be able to say, this is what works for me. I'm going to look at these ideas, look at these structures, look at these frameworks with an analytical eye, know my student population, and know what's going to work best. And so I tried to present things in such a way where we get a 5,000-foot view of some big ideas and big theories, and not a single one of them is better than the other. It's just a matter of what works for your kids. So I tried to present those things in a way where they could not modular in nature, but flexible.
What do you thinking about that first year teacher who's going to be walking into the classroom, been assigned to gifted? What do you think for many of those teachers, the biggest myths about gifted education that they might hold as they're coming into this classroom, and myths that aren't true? Do you have a sense of that?
Certainly. Yeah, thinking that it's going to be easy. Oh, I've got the smart kids, no problem. This is going to be a cakewalk. It's not. Students are just as diverse within gifted populations as they are within the rest of the population of your school. So thinking that it will be easy is certainly not the case. Thinking that parents are going to be a nightmare and that they're going to be uptight, also not the case. I've had the great pleasure of working with some really wonderful and supportive parents. There's a section in the book about leveraging parents, as allies, and working with them to really have the student at the center of the educational process. So kids are easy, parents are hard. No. I would say those are some myths. Believing that your students will be good at everything, also not true. You may have some students who are several grades above in math, but they really struggle to read on grade level. So expecting your students to be the same across the board in terms of ability is also a myth that I would caution teachers about. I'm trying to brainstorm some other common things that you think, oh,
While you're
well,
thinking, I was
that's a,
thinking. Well, I was going to mention that this is 30 years ago, so I know things are different now. But when I was teaching, we used to have these courses that were called correlated classes, and then you had regular classes, which were the general ed classes, and correlated wasn't special ed; it was just sort of struggling learners, and so they'd sort of put the struggling learners in one room, and then you had the general ed program and the gifted class. And I was fortunate enough to teach all three, and the two that exhausted me all the time were the struggling learners and the gifted learners. Gifted ed was a breeze, because you're just always on your toes. It is, and I loved it. I mean, I loved all of it, but you are on your toes with both of those groups. Yeah. So I that what you said really rang true.
and another sort of along those lines, you're going to have students that struggle. You will have gifted students that fail state standardized or whatever standardized accountability assessment you have. You will have students who will hit a wall with content and not know what to do. They're not going to sail through everything. Even your very bright students are going to struggle. And so making a place for and anticipating that struggle in the classroom is definitely some advice that I would give to new teachers of gifted students.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thinking about that, like what you just said, how do you plan to meet the needs of gifted students when there is such a wide range of abilities and interest levels within a single classroom?
Sure. If you are brand new to this, I would go in and first and foremost look at what your student assessment data can tell you. Work smarter and not harder. Use what you already have. Use the data that you have on file. Look at your identification metrics and see, well, how does that inform my programming? What does that tell me about my kids? Do I have a whole bunch of students who are identified largely around math ability? So what types of services do I need to provide for them? Doing a really reading focused heavy unit might not be appropriate. So just start at the beginning like you would with any of your classrooms and look and see what the data tells you and allow that data to inform your subsequent decisions. I would also really encourage the use of student interest surveys. Um, it's so important to know what is relevant to your students. What do they want to know? How do they learn? Having that information at the get-go really helps you to craft activities, craft learning around where your students are and what's meaningful to them. Um, I would also, looking at classes that maybe they're multi-age, maybe they are multi-faceted, multi-themed. I would consider including tiered activities where every student has the ability to enter the learning conversation, enter that activity at a comfort level that allows them to feel engaged and heard and not like they're going to be bored or like they're really going to struggle. Tiered activities are a wonderful thing to include in your planning. Um, and I would also encourage the use of formative assessments in the gifted classroom. This might look a little different if you've got a pull-out program than if you had a full-time gifted class, or if you're working in a gifted academy or another model where you see the students more frequently. But utilizing, whether it's a longer form or a simpler form of formative assessment, really helps you know where to begin with your kids. Um, Let's see, I would also say that as you plan and as you craft learning experiences for your students, ask yourself, how flexible is this activity? What degree of choice am I building into this activity? And what is the expected level of independence for these kiddos? Keeping those three questions in mind will really help make sure that everybody from your students who are bright and are going to benefit from this but might struggle with the content a little, all the way to these kids who are just blowing it out of the water, everybody feels at home and everybody feels some ownership of that learning.
You know, not that I mean, all of this is, you know, hindsight 2020. This would have been best to have you do the first webinar we did, and then have all of the other webinars after that, because so many of the webinars that we've done are the sort of the nuts and bolts kind of things you're talking about. We had Laurie Westfall coming in to talk about choice and menus. We had Todd Stanley coming in to talk about choice and project-based learning and individualized instruction. They're you know, the toolkit that a teacher has to use in order to differentiate for this wide range is pretty vast. And I mean, that's why I have a publishing company on that topic. You know, there's just enough out there. And what your book does nicely is it sort of is this it's this sort of holistic overview of, you know, how do we do this properly, and then a teacher can go in and pull a resource that says, oh, I want to use, you know, simulation and role play in this classroom, and so then how do I do that? I want to individualize for different rates of learning in my own classroom, and or I want to differentiate for differences in content. You know, those are all sort of the pull-out things, the individual things, the pieces that a teacher could use and be successful in the classroom. Can I shift gears a little bit and ask you about, because you're steeped in the research now, and I know you're working under Dr. Ann Wren at UNT, who's got a special interest in social and emotional needs of gifted. What does the research say about the social and emotional needs of gifted, and what is the role of the teacher in the classroom as they're working with gifted kids?
Um, well, what research tells us is that our gifted students are not going to be more prone to psychological illness. They're not going to be more prone to depression. We may see things like anxiety and perfectionism as a byproduct of some of the expectations and environments in gifted education, but just as human beings, as people that kind of come hardwired for some things, some of that's another myth, kind of circling back to what we talked about earlier, that our gifted kids are just so emotionally and socially different. um, that we simply don't have the research to support that. Before we started, I really wanted to talk about an article, but it is by Paula Olszewski-Kubilius.
Uh,
Oh boy.
Olszewski
Yeah,
Kubilius.
there we go. I really, really made a pig's ear of that with Rena Subotnick and Frank Worrell. It is a piece in High Ability Studies where they talk about the psychosocial skills for talent development. And that is an article that I think really, really sums up nicely, along with the counseling considerations um, by Cross for working with gifted students. What we want to focus on, I think, is how do we give our kids the psychosocial skills to maximize talent development? And maximize talent development, simply to me, means how am I making sure that my kids have all of the opportunities to engage in the learning that's going to grow them as a whole person. Some of those skills, this is not exhaustive of this research at all, we can work to build self-efficacy in the classroom. We can teach our students to recognize strengths and weaknesses in themselves. And, you know, recognizing the weakness, you don't have to feel bad about it. You just have to know, hey, I'm going to need some extra help when it comes to this. Or boy, as a teacher, you know, getting them to recognize strengths and weaknesses, you also use that as an opportunity to leverage strengths-based approaches in the classroom so that students do have a really nicely rounded view of what they can do. And again, we're building that self-efficacy. This is really a recursive process here. And the ability to regulate emotions and manage moods. And I mean, that's good for all of us. But if you fail, and that's okay, what do we do? How do we come back from that? One thing I would really encourage teachers to do is fail in front of your students, not in such a way where they go home and they're like, that teacher doesn't know anything. But when I would write things on the board, you know, I taught high school English for a while. I didn't know how to spell some of those things. And I would be like, hey, can somebody read that out of the book? Or, oh man, bad idea. Miss Lockhart really messed that up. Or as you write in front of them, I got to cross out that sentence. That's not okay. I'm not going to worry about it. I'm going to go back later. But just showing them that you're human, showing them that everything's not perfect, and that we make mistakes. We use positive self-talk. We use those coping mechanisms to come right on out of it and move forward, and that we can focus on being the best us, being the best learners that we can be through leveraging those skills for talent development.
Yeah, I think there's so many habits of mind and behaviors that can either be a roadblock or a conveyance to success. You know, and like I've always thought, well, golly, it's tough if we, you know, for example, in a Renzulli enrichment model where you're exposing a lot of kids to some very exciting things and they pick up a passion for one of them. It would be tough if they found the passion and then didn't have the habits of mind to have the tenacity, the grit, the kind of stick-to-itiveness that allows them to fail sometimes, to recover from that, to move on. So the soft skills are in terms of performance are really important. I mean, absolutely, I agree with what you're saying. Can you talk a little bit about, let's think, I'm going to shift over from the social emotional and think a little bit about curriculum for a second. What are some considerations when we're thinking about curriculum for gifted learners that those first year teachers ought to be sort of cognizant of?
Well, I would be just aware that curriculum is a recursive process of selection and development, so you're never really done. Um, in the book on page 11, I think I look at different principles for effective curriculum development or selection. Some of us are in the position where our administrative team has said, you have this budget. We would like for you to purchase some curriculum for gifted students. When I was in that position, my initial go-to was the Lori Westfall menu books to have and to give to the general education teachers, because that imparted so much choice and so much flexibility for my students. And if you're in a purchasing position where you need to go out and buy curriculum, where development, you don't have the manpower, or you don't have the finances to do that, definitely check out those principles. Some of the most important ones are that the content is organized around big ideas and themes, and you really want awesome, thank you,
You're welcome.
that you want to emphasize authentic and real world problems, products, and performances. So you want the students to be creating, and you want them to be thinking as if they are going to share this with people who are going to go somewhere and do something with it, or this is going to be the impetus for them to really take that content and apply it. You also want to make sure that the learning and the material reflects your student demographic. You want to make sure that opportunities to reflect on the cultures and the aspects of community that are present in your system are also present in curriculum, so it's relevant for your students.
That makes a lot of sense. Let me grab the screen back. Yeah, and I and is engaging too. I find that one of the you think about like a kid who's gifted, who's in a general education classroom that is teaching to uh, the and I'm not saying every general ed class is like this. I'm just saying this is a bad example of a teacher sort of teaching to the middle, and that kid is just stuck there without challenge in that classroom. And it's very possible. I mentioned this when I was talking about behavior checklists. I remember a teacher who did this when I was in the classroom, and we had a kid who was, he had an IQ of 135. His achievement scores were like 98th, 99th percentile. And this teacher, when he filled out the behavior checklist for the kid, like rated him lowest on everything and said, "This is the laziest kid I've had in 20 years." And there's a piece of curriculum that is about challenge. I mean, we like to be engaged and we like to be challenged. Thinking about a part of the piece of the curriculum then is the assessment piece. Can you talk a little bit about how do we measure outcomes with kids when we're using advanced curriculum?
And this kind of goes back into the process of selection or development of curriculum, is taking a big step back and looking and saying, what are my district goals? When the district defines gifted, when your school says this is who we're serving and how we're serving them, what are the programmatic goals? So you want to line up those student outcome goals with the goals of the program, just so from the top down, everything makes sense, and you can ensure to the best of your ability that you're serving your students in a way that is thoughtful and well aligned. If you choose to look at maybe state standardized tests as just a baseline for how are my kids doing, I would caution you, because first of all, those are typically high stakes tests, and you're going to have kids that fail them. Those tests also have a ceiling. So that's not going to give you, if you offer accelerated math services, for example, but the student is taking on grade level assessments, you're not going to get an accurate view of what they can do and what they know. So when you're looking at some of those quantitative metrics, just be aware that those that help you see progress are typically great ways to go. I worked in a system where we used MAP the measures of academic progress. That was helpful in just seeing where students were. Was it the be-all, end-all? No, but did it give a nice picture of where kids grew from the fall to the spring? Sure, it did. Looking at things like portfolio-based assessments to kind of gauge student growth from the beginning of the year to the end of the year. In Texas, and part of our state plan suggests that we use project-based learning opportunities, this Texas Performance Standards Project. Those come with rubrics that help evaluate as you go and then at the end. So having a portfolio that was rubric-based gives you a really nice view of what students can do. Florida has a framework for K-12 gifted learners that helps to really concretely outline what student outcomes could look like, both quantitatively and qualitatively. Places where you have gifted IEPs, Colorado comes to mind, they have advanced learning programs for students, and everybody has a different goal. So I think you could go at it a variety of ways, but really, again, using those formative assessment pieces, where do we start out and how do we end? And I would also say that it's really important that whatever metrics you use, there is a place for student self-reflection. So we're really getting a full view of where this kiddo was and how your services and programs directly impact their progress and their growth.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's a two-sided coin too, and I'm going to butcher these stats. I apologize because it was in graduate school that I remembered this from. But okay, but so bear with me because the point is, you know, a pretty good one. I remember that Sally Reese and Joe Renzulli had done some research at one point that looked at gifted fourth graders, and you know, coming into the fourth grade year, how much of the content that was going to be taught in the general ed program did the kids already know? And it was some extraordinary number, like 66% or 80% of the content that the kids were going to have to, you know, learn in fourth grade, they already knew coming into that classroom. So assessment is such a key tool, as long as then once you do the assessment, then that sort of informs your instruction as well. I think, which is you know, the challenge. One final thing, you know, gifted programs, not always the most popular program in the school, and you do a nice job, I think, in your book of talking about, you know, how do we build bridges, how do we try to build a more school-wide support for the gifted program and the what we're doing with gifted kids. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, I think that again ties in really nicely with the outcome piece. So as you advocate for your students, as you advocate for the programs, first and foremost, involve the campus administrators and say, hey, here are student outcomes. And even if they need a little bit of work, that's okay. It's a work in progress. That evidences that, hey, we need some attention. Hey, you know, get them involved wherever you are, make them aware of what is going on their campus. An effective instructional leader will take that information and they will partner with you, and they will create opportunities to grow the program and grow services. Sometimes that means getting a little bit creative. I mean, we all work in budget constraints, but really just making them aware of that information is a great place to start. I'm also a huge proponent of attending planning sessions, whether that is a grade level planning session, whether you're visiting ELAR, math, science, you know, departmentalized planning sessions, and just saying, hey, can I come sit in here? I really want to know what you're doing. That tells those teachers that what you're providing in your classroom, whatever your services look like, you know, a lot of times as gifted teachers, we feel like we're on an island and we're, you know, we're a planning team of 1 or 2 if we're lucky. The other teachers, I don't know what they're doing in there. They're glitter and cardboard and it's all a good time. But going in there and saying, oh yeah, we worked on that in math this week, or oh, that's a really great extension idea for science. We have this PBL going on. I wonder how we could tie that in, and show them that the services are an integral part of their students' learning and that you're on the same team. You're not living out in craft world over there, that you're really trying to support the instruction that they're providing in the classroom. And you can form partnerships for planning. You can collaborate. They may even ask you to help build out some extensions for their classrooms, and just really make connections in that way. So that you're a visible part of the instructional team, because as a special programs teacher, and I know many of you are also coordinators as well, that it's an important part to be included in that campus culture, and in that campus planning. Working with the counselors, particularly at the upper levels, we're all wanting to make sure our students' college and career readiness is effective and appropriate for the learning. We want to make sure that their advanced learning opportunities really align with what those students need, along with certainly some of those social emotional pieces. So partnering with the counseling staff is also a great way to build relationships and advocate for your programs. Bringing parents in, bringing the community stakeholders in, and really widening things out, being very transparent. Here's what we're doing. Here's how this is making our school and our community a better place. Here's this potential. Get in on this with me. We want you here. We want your feedback. So just being as open and as accessible, and I know that's hard when you're one person and you're doing a lot, but that truly will pay off in dividends.
Yeah, I loved your idea that the communication of what we're doing in the classroom is important, because there is so many of the strategies and approaches that we take in gifted education that would be fantastic and would benefit the regular education program. It's just that, like you said, quite often we feel like we're an island and we're not out there. I suspect that if you did, I mean, I don't know that this is absolutely true, but I suspect if you look at a lot of the educational innovations, like problem-based learning and project-based learning and inquiry-based learning, I think a lot of that stuff bubbles up from, if not gifted education, certainly advanced academics, and then it trickles down to all the other aspects of general education. So I 100% agree with you about the communication. Let me take a moment and do a little housekeeping, and let me encourage the audience. Please go in and ask your questions now while I'm doing this little bit of housekeeping. Please upvote questions that you want Stephanie, when she takes over here in just a second, to ask our Carrie. And but the housekeeping here is, let me give you Carrie's contact information in case you'd like to reach out to her. What I would suggest, I can't leave this on for too long, so if you just take a screenshot, you can grab Carrie's email address, and then you guys can communicate offline if you'd like. And then also, let me remind you once again, this is Carrie's book, What to Expect When You're Expected to Teach Gifted Students. This is new release just this year, and if you'll also just take a screenshot of that, you'll have the ISBN and all the ordering information. You can get that at proofrock.com, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, or your local bookseller. So Stephanie, if you'll, I think we've got quite a bit of activity in the Q&A section. If you want to take over, that'd be great.
Yeah, sure thing. It's been a very lively discussion. So our most popular question here is, can you also talk about differentiating when you have a mix of gifted and non-gifted students within one class? My district does not separate gifted and non-gifted within classes.
Yeah, absolutely. And first and foremost, let's all acknowledge how hard that is. That's very, very difficult. As a classroom teacher, I had a variety of students in my classroom as well. And in 45 minutes, I've got to do the whole instructional progression. We've got to work with the kids who need additional support. And then by the time you're at the end, like, oh boy, where did it all go? It's hard. It's very difficult. So what I would highly recommend doing, I'm going to go back to the suggestion from the very beginning for tiered instruction. It takes a little bit longer to set up, so there is a planning element of tiered instruction that is going to require some attention. But once you get that off the ground and you are able to have different levels of students working on the same general idea and general topic, that makes giving those groups attention that's appropriate and engaging that much easier. And I realize that we all have standards around which we must plan, but we all know that if we're looking for mastery of a standard, then maybe we create an assignment that is going to give us what we need for mastery, and for some students that's appropriate. We can also include elements of depth and complexity to really take that standard to the next level, and maybe that assignment is appropriate for kiddos at a different tier. But the heart of tiered instruction is that you're all speaking the same language, you're all learning the same standard. The how is what is different. So that is one piece of differentiation advice that I would give. I would also really encourage, where you can, give students choice in how they complete assignments. Again, I'm coming from an English language arts background, but giving students the ability to choose a response, choose a way to tackle the learning around a rubric that is appropriate for everyone. That's another way to differentiate in the classroom. I'm going to go to the classic, the most difficult first, thinking about math. If we have 10 questions, but your students can do the 2 most difficult ones, why in the world is there a need for them to do the other 8 practice questions? There's not. They've demonstrated mastery, they can go on. And that's a mini form of curriculum compacting. If they're able to demonstrate mastery on that, they can probably go on with minimal scaffolding to the next thing, and that's okay. And I know people say, well, what if they do that over and over and over again? Then maybe it's time for a conversation about acceleration. That's okay too. So I think in terms of differentiation, those are the top 3 that come to mind: building in choice, building in tiers of learning opportunities, and allowing students, as they demonstrate mastery, to move at a different pace within the same classroom.
Yeah, and I don't want to be the guy, hawking books over here, but we have, I mean, that's what, we've done. I mean, we've built out for over the years a whole segment of differentiation products. We've got Cheryl Adams did a book on a practical guide to tiered lessons in the classroom. And, as you know, Carrie, I mean, we've just built a lot of resources that are very practical, that have a research base, but they give you the tools for differentiation. Although you're absolutely right in acknowledging just how hard it is to do that in a classroom. It's an ongoing process.
Yeah, our next question is kind of more of a comment, but maybe you can speak to it a little bit. I would say that teaching gifted students can sometimes be a bit tougher than non-gifted. In my experience, gifted students are often on the spectrum from extremely motivated to extremely unmotivated, and you have them all together in the same class. So maybe talk a little bit about the motivation piece of that.
I would very much like to recommend the work of Jim Delisle, Dr. Jim Delisle, looking at motivation and underachievement and some of the underlying factors for that. But in terms of looking at motivation as it exists in your classroom, if you have a chronically underachieving student, I would start with, first and foremost, talking to that student. Have you sat down and have you had a conversation with that kiddo? Why are we missing all of our assignments for this quarter? It seems like you're really you're not showing me what you're telling me in class when they're lively and they're talking, but that productivity doesn't manifest itself at the end of the day. Sit down and ask the student why in a low risk environment. Maybe you're having lunch together, maybe it's just an aside, it's not in front of the whole class, obviously. Talk to the student. That seems very simple, but that's certainly where I would begin. And as a teacher, you're going to have a good sense of, how is my student motivated? Is it extrinsic motivation? Is it grades that they're after? Is it recognition from their peers? Is it something that, are they coming from a very competitive household? Where does the motivation lie? What seems to get them moving? Is it intrinsic motivation? I'm not going to do your assignments. I don't want to. It's not interesting. I'm not motivated to do it at all. And then we get back into the element, well, how much choice is there involved? So, I mean, intrinsic and extrinsic motivation is pretty, you know, personality 101, but really starting there and seeing what makes your student tick. And if we're talking about chronic underachievement, giving that kiddo a plan and giving them some ownership of developing that plan and saying, okay, here's where we are. Where do you want to be? How do we get you there? And giving them attainable goals, letting them have a hand in creating those goals and giving feedback along the way. Along the same lines for motivation, I would also look and say, what's the role of feedback in my classroom? Is feedback just summative? And I say, all right, well, here's the grade, you did great, or ooh, this really missed the mark, let's try differently next time. Or telling the kids, yeah, this is a good first start, you're going to get a second chance. Or just giving them the ongoing feedback that they would need to say, okay, I can accomplish this, I can follow through with this. So really saying, is feedback more summative or is it an ongoing thing? And what structures can you put in place to make it more ongoing for your students so that they can make the progress that you know they're capable of making?
Hey, Carrie, have you seen this book? Jim Delisle just did this this book with ASCD, Doing Poorly on Purpose. Have you seen that book yet?
No, I haven't.
Yeah, well, it was just, I mean, it was related to what you were talking about with Jim's discussions of motivation and whatnot. And I suspect it's a great book. I haven't read it yet. It's not a Proofrock book, but but you know, Jim will be in 2 weeks, so for his webinar, so I'll ask him about it a little bit, I guess, too. Okay, well, thanks. I didn't mean to interject, but yeah, go ahead, Stephanie.
Yeah, we had a couple of questions about distance learning. So Carrie, earlier you mentioned looking at data to try to figure out how to meet students' needs. So what data would we look at coming back from distance learning?
Oh boy, that's a hard question to answer. I know the way our school district has tackled grading, how we've come up with those guidelines and expectations. As a teacher, I would start with, where were the kids pre-break? And again, I'm going to use that formative assessment tool when we go back in August, just with basic beginning of the year information. Where were they then? Where are they now? And then I'm assessing the gaps in between. But this is very difficult. This is unprecedented, and what we're living right now is going to affect our students. We don't know how. We don't know all of the way it's going to affect our students and the long-term implications. So as you look at that data, be sensitive to that as well. All of our kiddos are in different situations, and every family is, you know, living this a little bit differently. But I think the most reliable information you're going to get is in terms of hard quantitative data, as far as what your kids know, report cards, district assessments, things like that. I would look and see where they are, even portfolio content, prior to when this break happened. And then again, formative assessment in the fall, and I would run that formative assessment almost as if, well, hey, there's no break, but we're about to start this unit on multiplication, for example. Where are you on my assessment piece here? And you can really see, oh, well, hey, they didn't miss too much, or, oh my gosh, they're doing amazing, they're trucking right along, or now we know where those gaps are to fill. That's not a great answer to the question, but truly, I think that start with what you know and what is reliable, and look at what has gone on during distance learning as a good insight to how your students process in stressful situations. And that's simply what it is. Without the aid of a teacher, you know, with many, many, many extraneous variables that you can't control, this is what your kiddos did. But I don't think much of what we got, particularly for our younger students, and I say this is the royal we as educators, I don't know how indicative that's going to be of marked student progress.
Right, and I have had this conviction all along that when whatever end this has, we are going to so appreciate these teachers. This has been like, wow, that you know the realization of how hard teaching is if you're a parent now trying to do it at home, and you're just like, and all I had was 2. How did that person do it with 25 in the same classroom? Stephanie, maybe one more question, and then we're about out of time. So maybe one more question, Stephanie.
Sure thing. So also related to distance learning, it sounds like a couple of teachers have felt like their GT kids have dropped off the grid because of the learning style. They get so interested in all their special interests that they forget that they have English assignments or science. And then maybe rushing through assignments rather than taking more time as you might when you're in the physical classroom.
I know that a lot of the teacher feedback I heard where the big theme is, I'm going to skip straight to the assignment. I'm not going to read the overwhelming majority of the directions. Not going to watch the video. I'm going to see if I can do this without any of that. And so assignments are not quite done. They're, you know, the same thing that you would struggle with the same kids who are going to raise their hand. I don't understand how to do this. Do you read the directions? No. Okay, well, maybe that's a cool place to start. But as far as students who have, so yes, that is a very common thing. I think as teachers, we can use that as a jumping off point. So look at how much better you did when you read those directions. And you have, what a wonderful thing about distance learning is that all of the student progress is captured. We have Google Doc revision history, we have Zoom meetings, we have Q&A, we have emails. So we can go back and we can say, what about my instructional delivery, or what about these instructions? You know, are the kids not reading? How can I change this up? How can I improve this? And then with the students, look at how much better this is when we're all on the same page, we're all speaking the same language. And so some of that, I think, is just going to have to be a learning piece that we can definitely implement in a number of positive ways when we get back into the classroom. But I would stress for those kiddos who are, you know, reading tomes about black holes, but they're not doing their math homework. Is there a way where we could bring some aspect of that interest into their assignment? Can we reframe this word problem? If we're reading nonfiction, does it have to be the nonfiction piece that's selected, or can it be a piece that they've selected that have the same genre characteristics? So I would really encourage integrating their interest, especially if that's what's going to tell you whether or not they've mastered it. Like, at the end of the day, do I care that we all read the same text, or do I care that you can, to mastery, analyze a nonfiction piece effectively and synthesize new information and new ideas from it? Do I care that we all did the same question out of our tech book, or do I care that you understand these mathematical concepts? Truly, I care that you're learning. And so if I can bring what you're interested in into that learning in any way, and I mean, we know it doesn't have to be a laser light spectacular of cool interactive project. The kids love it when you talk about them, when you use them as an example in class. It can be a little thing and they'll be like, oh yeah, she knows I like that. She included that in the lesson. I'm going to do that. So I think those are little modifications, little tweaks that we can make to engage our students. But you're absolutely right. It's a struggle right now.
Yeah, there's no easy answers. You've been tasked with a couple of really hard questions. You did a great job. I appreciate it. Stephanie, thank you so much for handling the Q&A section. Thank you for all the great questions and all the upvotes. That gave Stephanie a lot of information about where to go with those questions. I want to thank the audience for attending. This was a fantastic group, a lot of good discussion in the Q&A box, and we're so appreciative that you guys showed up. Carrie, thank you so much for being here. We sure do appreciate it.
I appreciate the opportunity, and I appreciate everybody who joined in this conversation. Thank you guys so much.
Great. Now everybody go out and buy that book. It's a great book. See you later, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.